Good morning, everyone. Also good afternoon and also
Hi,
good
Julia.
evening. I know that we have participants, we have speakers, we have attendees that are crossing or that are located in many different zones, right? And so we want to welcome all of you to the second and the final day of the 14th Human Rights in Asia Conference. So my name is Julie Olson. I am an LLM student here at the University of Essex, and I'm studying international human rights law. And I'm also part of the student organizing committee for this year's Human Rights in Asia Conference. And it is my pleasure to be the moderator for today's event. So as I said before, I see that we're joined here today by many people who attended the conference last Saturday, but then also some new attendees as well. So I would like to welcome everybody again. And also I wanted to make sure to highlight that the annual Human Rights in Asia Conference is a project that is organized wholly by this students studying human rights at the University of Essex, both within the law department as well as a master's program. And this is being put on with the support of the Human Rights Center here at the university. And the conference really aims to shine a light on the field of human rights in Asia, because despite its very large population, despite the political importance of the region, it is frequently neglected in human rights education here in the UK. So we're excited that the 14th Human Rights in Asia Conference will examine Indigenous peoples' collective rights in the Asia region, and with a particular focus this year on the contemporary challenges as well as victories that Indigenous peoples face. And it's really crucial to learn about this topic from the perspective of Indigenous peoples themselves. And so therefore, this conference aims to feature speakers who identify as Indigenous. And during last week, the first day of the conference, we were accompanied by 3 different panelists. And so for those of you who perhaps weren't able to make it last week, I'll just briefly touch on some of the key points that were brought up last week. So of the 3 panelists, we started out with Pulman Chowdhury from Nepal, and he spoke to us about his role in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And then we also had Mai Tin Yumon from Myanmar, who shared with us about her experience, her participation in the Global Youth Indigenous Caucus. And then finally, we heard from Gladson Dongdong from India, who shared with us his experience as a human rights activist and a member of the Adivasis. It was an important group of panelists who really described the threats that Indigenous peoples face on a daily basis. Also adding a personal touch, right? As they themselves are members of those, or are Indigenous peoples and members of those communities. And there were many themes that were touched on last week, I would say. But one of the most prominent ones that was highlighted and that was mentioned in various forms throughout the different presentations from each of the speakers was the deep connections that Indigenous peoples have to the lands, territories, and resources, and their resistance against the nation state, as well as other actors, but you could say primarily the nation state, who aim to possess and to claim those lands and territories and resources. And so many panelists highlighted and touched and discussed the creativity of Indigenous peoples to use the international system, clearly the UN system, to demand their collective rights. And then also going further than that, the significant effort that Indigenous peoples have put to really breach the gap between the recognition of Indigenous peoples' collective rights and then also the implementation of them as well. So we are lucky today to have 3 more incredibly important and distinguished panelists who I think will continue to mention a lot of these themes, going deeper into them, but then also highlighting new points and new themes. And we'll be able to hear about the work and the resistance carried out at the international level, the regional level, and then also the grassroots level. So our agenda today is as follows. We will begin with our three speakers. Today's keynote address will be from Victoria Tauli-Corpuz, who is a former UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous peoples, and she's coming from the Philippines. We will follow up with another speaker from the Philippines. We have Joanne Carlin, who is currently the Executive Director of Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. And then we also have Khalil Alamor, who raises awareness about the rights of the Indigenous Bedouin community in Israel. So we'll follow those three presentations, those three speakers, with a joint question and answer session after the three speakers have finished. And then the conference will be closed today by Dr. Julian Barker. And before passing the floor over to our first speaker, our keynote speaker, just a few housekeeping rules that specifically have to do with the question and answer session that we'll have, the joint one at the end, is that throughout the presentations, please go ahead and use the question and answer feature on Zoom at the very bottom to put in any questions that you have. And then there's also different ways to either maintain your name associated with it or make it anonymous as well. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker in a little bit more depth, I would say, right? So we're excited and very honored to have with us Victoria Tauli-Corpuz, an Indigenous leader from the Cordillera Region of the Philippines. And she has worked for over 3 decades on building movements among Indigenous peoples and as an advocate for women's rights, human rights and women's rights. She is also the founder and the executive director of Tebtebba Foundation. Her global influence includes the Indigenous and Gender Advisor of the Third World Network and a member of the United Nations Development Program Civil Society Organizations Advisory Committee. She's also a member of the World Future Council in September 2017, and then the chairperson-rapporteur of the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Populations. She was also appointed by the Human Rights Council and served as a Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples from 2014 until 2020. And she was the former chair of the Indigenous Peoples and she was the former chair, of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples from 2005 to 2010, where she was one of the key players in drafting regarding the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. So thank you very much, and I will pass the floor now to Victoria.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you very much to the students for organizing this. I will basically deal with a brief history of the struggles of Indigenous peoples, why they went to the UN to push for a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Then I will discuss how the Indigenous peoples have asserted the whole concept of collective rights within the United Nations, which is of course consolidated, enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I will end with a few recommendations on how to move ahead. So, I participated in the UN in the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1985, and that was the year that the declaration was being discussed. The UN Working Group was mandated to look into the development of indigenous things happening in indigenous peoples communities, as well as to draft a declaration. And it started in 1982. So when I came in, I met, of course, a lot of the indigenous peoples who have been participating in the process, and most of us who were there because we had our own issues, like here in the Cordillera in the Philippines, we were faced with the problem of martial law. Now there was a dictatorship under the Marcos regime, and they were imposing huge infrastructure development projects like hydroelectric dams in our communities, and without asking us or without even allowing us to participate in any of the decisions or discussions leading towards this decree. So under the dictatorship, a decree will just say, okay, we will build these 2 dams, we get money from the World Bank, and we are going to put it in the Chico River in the Cordillera region, which will basically drown hundreds of thousands of hectares, and of course hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples have to be displaced. So our elders decided that people should protest against it, and as students we took part in this protest. And when I went to the UN, that was the reason why we went to the UN actually, because we cannot find justice in the Philippines. There is no court that will receive our complaints, and we don't have the means to bring even the issue to the courts, and it was martial law. So we thought, oh, there is a United Nations where we can go and talk about our issues and raise this and make it more visible. So that's why we were in the United Nations, and that's how we got drawn into the discussions and negotiations on the declaration. And when I was there, I met all these people who have similar problems. No, one of the key problems, of course, is all these developments being brought without their consent to their territories. No, these are infrastructure developments, whether dams or roads, no, highways, among others. But the other thing that was brought to the attention of the experts was that this racism and discrimination. No, that indigenous peoples felt they were not allowed to speak their languages. They were forced to accept that a country, a nation, has only one language, one nation, and one culture. And indigenous peoples cannot accept this. They said, we don't believe in, I mean, there's no such thing as a national culture, you know, which is just the culture of the dominant population. No, so this was the kind of issue that many indigenous peoples brought to the attention of the UN. And I remember even one of our friends from Algeria, who is an Amasir, and his main problem was he was not even allowed, he was a lawyer, and he was not allowed to put his name in his language in his office, no? The use of his language was totally banned, no. So these were the issues that brought us to the United Nations, and most of these issues were related to our collective rights. These were not just our individual rights, no, our individual right to, you know, because these are cultural rights, these are rights to lands, territories, and resources, our right to self-govern and to use our own languages, among others. And most of these rights are not just simple individual rights, no? And so somehow with the United Nations, you know, the member states and the experts were sort of a bit shaken that what is this, you know? In fact, I remember very clearly one of the UK diplomats whom I was working with came to me and he said, Vicky, do you know that by bringing in this whole concept of collective rights, you are going to dismantle the human rights system in the UN? And I said, why? Because the human rights system is basically founded on individual human rights. And here you are bringing these collective rights. And it's something that that will challenge significantly individual human rights. No? So of course, we didn't accept that. Or, well, then we continue discussing. And that's how we all learned, you know, that indeed for us, while individual human rights are important, and we do not discount that, because many of us have been subjected to arrest, to harassments, to intimidation, no, among others, and even as indigenous women, we also have been subjected to the violation of our rights as women, the non-equality, violence, among others. So we do respect and we do acknowledge that individual human rights are important. But we also realize, we also want the world to know that we don't live as simply as individuals, you know, as Santaki said, you know, we live in a concentric circle. Maybe the person is in the middle, then the family, then the clan, then the society as a whole, no? And we are embedded in that whole circle, and we cannot find ourselves as just simple individuals, autonomous individuals who are claiming for our rights. We are claiming our rights not only for our collectivity, for our family or our clans or our ethnic, affiliation, but also even our past and our future, our ancestors, the rights that have been violated, you know, when our ancestors were living, and what they have taught us in terms of what we need to do as a younger people to pursue and assert and claim our rights. No, so this, and of course we also think of the future, that we cannot. One of our obligations as indigenous peoples is to think of our future generations, that our lands, which is the basis of our identities, of our knowledge, of our language, if these are all going to disappear, then we have nothing to leave behind for our future generations. So it's also a concept that cuts across time boundaries, no? It's not just for the present. So that's those are the kinds of sharing, that we did in the UN, in the working group. We keep on talking about all these issues and why it's so paramount for us that collective rights will be respected and recognized. And that's how we persisted and asserted. We continued asserting that, if the collective rights, if our collective rights will not be respected, then we will disappear, no? As distinct peoples, as distinct cultures, and as languages. And we believe that a nation state will not really be a nation if it disregards or totally ignores the plurality, no, of peoples, of cultures and languages. So it's the pluralism, no, that exists. That's the reality in most countries that we are trying this, we are making the states understand. The states cannot just go to the UN to say that we are one nation, one culture, one language. We have one territory, and nobody can, of course, undermine the integrity of the territory, as well as the sovereignty. And that's always the argument that was used against us, that by us coming to the UN, we are potentially undermining the territories, and of course the sovereignty of the nation state. And I remember one argument by the Cree, because the Cree peoples from Canada, they came also, and that was the time that there was a move in Quebec for autonomy or independence. And the Cree said, no, we don't like to be independent. We still like to be part of the Canadian state, but we are indigenous, and we would like our distinct identity to be recognized. So all these claims of states saying that we will destroy national unity cannot be substantiated, no? And so those were the assertions that we made. And so in the end, when we had the UN declaration, actually the declaration is generally a declaration that contains collective rights, that contains that enshrines the collective human rights of indigenous peoples. So and we think that it should be like that, because we already have instruments that protect individual human rights, although some parts of those instruments also recognize collective rights, no? The collective right to self-determination, as well as the right to cultures, no? Article 27 of the Convention on Civil and Political Rights is basically right to culture, although of course it still refers to individuals, but that's what it is, and of course the foundation of the rights of the collective rights that we were pursuing in the UN was our right to self-determination, no? That basically we think that is really what will, if that will be recognized, it will lay down the foundations for our assertion that we have the right to govern ourselves, because many indigenous peoples who go to the UN, they have their own indigenous governance systems, their justice systems, among others, and our right to continue to live with dignity in our lands, territories, and resources. We don't just claim individual rights to our lands and territories. We have collective rights, and these are rights that have allowed for us to continue protecting these territories and lands, and therefore we cannot be separated from these lands and territories, or displaced from these lands and territories, no? So those were the kinds of issues that we brought into the attention of the experts. And finally, when the declaration was adopted, we were satisfied with how it was finally adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council, no? And eventually by the UN General Assembly. We went through a lot of negotiations on the right to self-determination. There were a lot of attempts to water it down, to qualify it, no, but we stood pat. We said that no, you cannot qualify that right because that right is really the essential, the basic foundation of what we are demanding for, and by undermining it, by qualifying it, then you are going to basically weaken all the other articles as well. But in the end, we had to agree to that article, which sorts of says that this declaration will not in any way sort of destroy the sovereignty of nation states, no. And we have always asserted, we said that your fear of us pushing for independence or secession has no basis in fact, because those territories in which the nation state is which the nation state claims are our territories. Why should we secede? Why should we leave? Why should we allow ourselves to leave those territories when in fact that is what we are protecting? So I think for me, what has really emerged, what has evolved in this whole process of drafting the declaration is, it has, number one, it has of course made more visible the arguments, our basis, the concepts that we believe in, our concept of participation and inclusion, our concept of democracy, that there can be no decision taken that will directly impact us, that will not allow us to participate in making those decisions. I think those kinds of concepts have been strongly, argued in the process of drafting and negotiating the declaration. And I would dare say that the assertion of indigenous peoples of collective rights has enriched the human rights system, that the United Nations now is promoting. I can say that we did contribute significantly to the enrichment of the human rights framework of the UN. And now it's not very easy anymore to argue against collective rights. Of course, we understand the concern of some states that collective rights might be used to violate individual human rights. And that's why we say that's why we believe in the package of all these various human rights instruments, because we ourselves believe that we cannot use collective rights to harass or to lessen the right of a particular individual. And even in many of the submissions to the committees on human rights, the Committee on Human Rights, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the assertion of individual rights also have been included. So I think that's where what we have contributed into the into the human rights framework of the United Nations. And of course, we credit this achievement to the active participation of indigenous peoples all over the world. The knowledge of our leaders, of our intellectuals, of our ancestors that we use to strengthen our arguments, and of course the realities, many of our people, many of the indigenous peoples who come to the UN sometimes feel undergo harassment when they go back to their communities, but they had to dare to go to the UN, because this is the way that we can achieve, our dream of having the UN craft a declaration that will particularly address the issues, the problems that we face as indigenous peoples. As my colleague Mick Dodson said, when the declaration was adopted, he said, the declaration is a response to every cry, every anguish, every plea that indigenous peoples brought forth to the attention of the nation states in the United Nations. And so we would like to call on all the states, on the dominant society, to implement the declaration of is that now there are bodies within United Nations bodies, which are now we also succeeded in establishing the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' rights. No, I think those are results of the persistence of Indigenous peoples. Now, I would just like to say that with all these achievements that we have, we are not saying that our dream has been achieved. There is still a lot of human rights violations happening all over the world, especially among indigenous communities. Some of you may be aware that there is this report of the Global Witness, which says that last year, 297 persons were killed for defending the rights to their lands and territories, and 30% of these people are indigenous persons, indigenous individuals. No, and that's the reality that indigenous people still face up to this present time that we are talking here, and that's the challenge that remains for all of us. How do we make states implement the UN declaration which they have adopted at the United Nations General Assembly, and how do we monitor how they are implementing this? The monitoring of how our rights are being protected or being violated is crucial in making more concrete what the reality is for indigenous peoples all over the world. And therefore, the work of the academia, civil society organizations, of course, UN bodies who have adopted the policies, their own policies on indigenous peoples, are important. And I would like to end there because my 20 minutes have ended. But thank you very much for inviting me and for allowing me to speak a little bit on why collective rights is paramount, is of paramount importance to indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Victoria, thank you very, very much for that. And yeah, I think that you were right at 20 minutes. So thank you for that presentation and for sharing that. And I think that's some of the really interesting things that you mentioned as well, right? And especially since many of the participants here today are studying human rights at the University of Essex and at other universities, as well as kind of what you were talking about of the concept that you all brought of collective rights. And as we're learning about human rights, international human rights law, right, and that it is focused and directed on the individual. And then what you were mentioning about in the process of drafting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that Indigenous peoples brought that concept of collective rights that not only was juxtaposing in a bit, right, individual rights versus collective rights as well, and bringing that concept, but then also, as you mentioned, that it cut across time boundaries as well and talking about future generations. So thank you so much for sharing that with us and for telling us about your experience. I think that's really, really important. So great. And so now we'll go to our next speaker. And then also to before I introduce our next speaker, just a reminder that we will have a joint question and answer panel or session, I should say, after all the speakers have finished their presentations. And the best way to submit a question is to go to the bottom of Zoom and then to use the question and answer box as well. So thank you very much. Great. Okay, so now we are excited to present our second speaker, Joanne Carlin. Joanne Carlin is an Indigenous activist from the Cordillera region again of the Philippines, with more than 20 years of experience working on Indigenous issues from the grassroots level, the regional level, and then also the international level. And her expertise includes areas like human rights, sustainable development, the environment, and climate change. She was the General Secretary of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact from September 2008 until December 2016. And Joanne was an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2014 until 2016. She was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by UN Environment in September 2018. and she was the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development from March 2017 until December 2021. And currently she is the co-founder and currently the executive director of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Joanne. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and good day to everyone. Let me commend the organizers for this important conference. I believe this will contribute to raising more visibility and attention to Indigenous peoples in Asia who are now confronted with many challenges in the exercise of our collective rights. Working with Indigenous peoples across Asia for 8 years while I was based in Thailand has made me realize how systemic discrimination and racism against Indigenous peoples are deeply rooted in Asian societies. On many social events in different places where I identified myself as an Indigenous person while speaking in English, the reactions were some kind of a disbelief, with comments like, "You cannot be Indigenous if you speak English," or "How come you don't have a dark skin?" So the regard to Indigenous peoples as inferior and backward still prevails to this day. Our discrimination is deeply rooted in social and political systems in many countries in Asia. This is the main reason why Indigenous peoples formed and our organizations and networks from local, national, regional, and global levels as collective channels to counter discrimination, as we deserve to be treated with dignity and respect like everyone, and to assert our rights as Indigenous peoples. The persistence of struggles on the ground and advocacy and engagements with states by Indigenous peoples across the globe in asserting our rights to be recognized and respected resulted to the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the UN DRIP, by the UN General Assembly in 2017. This was already presented by Vicky earlier. And this was an act of upholding social justice, non-discrimination, and equality for all. The UN Declaration serves as the minimum standard for states and other actors to uphold the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. In spite of this historical milestone, many states in Asia continue to deny the legal recognition of Indigenous peoples and our rights. Wide-scale dispossession and destruction of Indigenous peoples' lands and resources remain as the order of the day, even during this period of the coronavirus pandemic. Likewise, discriminatory policies and practices against Indigenous peoples in Asia remain in place, ignoring the demands of Indigenous peoples for policy coherence with the UN Declaration in national laws and policies. The continuing lack of state recognition and protection of our rights at the local and national levels is the main reason why Indigenous peoples in Asia continue to demand for the UN system to uphold and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples as a matter of state obligation, commitment, and accountability. The UN Declaration is not providing special rights to Indigenous peoples, but rather consolidating rights from different human rights instruments as it applies to the particular and historical circumstances of Indigenous peoples, and to ensure non-discrimination and social equity. For example, the right to life and to property equates to our right to lands, territories, and resources. And for Indigenous peoples, this has been nurtured by our blood, sweat, and tears by our ancestors for intergenerational survival of Indigenous peoples in oneness with our territories. This was explained earlier by Vicky, the intergenerational aspect of our well-being, of how we relate to our territories is a critical element of our collective rights. The right to culture means the respect for our distinct identities as peoples, our set of beliefs and values, and our sustainable ways of life in maintaining harmonious and reciprocal relations with our environment. The right to employment means our right to practice our traditional occupations and livelihoods, including our systems of collective management of resources, mutual cooperation, and exchange labor. The engagement of Indigenous peoples and our allies with relevant UN bodies and mechanisms to demand accountability by states to their human rights obligations are full of challenges due to the lack of enabling environment to optimize these mechanisms as tools in addressing the human rights concerns of Indigenous peoples. The forms of engagements with the UN systems are through submission of complaints or communications, reports, and requested inputs by the different bodies, participation to relevant meetings, conferences, dialogues with states and relevant UN bodies, among others. The key challenges for the effective engagements of Indigenous peoples to relevant UN bodies and mechanisms include the following. One, the lack of knowledge on Indigenous peoples' rights as affirmed by the UN Declaration and the understanding of relevant human rights conventions and mechanisms. Thereby, there is a need to conduct more thorough education campaigns on Indigenous peoples' rights, and this requires also consideration to the level of literacy of Indigenous peoples' communities. As you are aware, Indigenous peoples across Asia have the lowest level of literacy. Second point is the lack of skills and capacities to conduct monitoring, documentation, and research for evidence-based advocacy in asserting the recognition and protect of our collective rights. In this context, Indigenous youth that have access to education can play a critical role in undertaking these needed tasks. Partnerships with research and academic institutions based on respectful relations in support of Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being can address this gap. Third, as you know, Asia is the most diverse in terms of languages, and majority of Indigenous peoples in the region cannot speak English or Chinese as the UN languages in the region. This huge limitation is worse for Indigenous women, thereby limiting our effective engagements, such as in preparing and submitting complaints or communications or reports and participating in specific meetings, among others. Four is the lack of advocacy and engagement, skills for advocacy and engagement with states and the UN system, and the need to develop young leaders to sustain the engagement of Indigenous peoples in demanding state accountability to respect and protect our rights. And five is the lack of resources for documentation and also for travel, for visa requirements, among others, thereby limiting our direct participation and preparation of reports in relation to our engagement with relevant UN mechanisms. Yet, in spite of these challenges, a growing number of Indigenous peoples with support from allies are able to engage in relevant UN bodies to raise our concerns and the continuing violation of our rights at the local and national levels. Our communications, reports, and meetings and dialogues with these bodies are resulting to evident observations, statements, and recommendations in upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples as part of states' human rights duties and obligations. The actions by these bodies and mechanisms demonstrate that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was founded from existing human rights conventions and state parties have ratified. I can share to you an initial compilation of the observations and recommendations of UN bodies and mechanisms relating to indigenous peoples. Let me then cite some of the key recommendations, statements, and observations of treaty bodies and mechanisms in upholding the rights of indigenous peoples in different countries in Asia. First is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Just this year in February 2022, they made recommendations particularly for the state of Thailand. The committee expresses concern about the report of direct and indirect multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination faced by ethnic and ethno-linguistic groups and indigenous peoples. The committee recommends that the state party takes legislative and policy measures necessary to tackle all forms of discrimination faced by ethnic and ethno-religious groups and indigenous peoples, and to ensure they have non-discriminatory access to civil and political, economic, social, and cultural rights on an equal basis with others. In particular, it recommends that the state party affirm its legislation, that in its legislation, the status and the rights of indigenous peoples in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Second, adopt and implement policies and programs for reducing poverty and enhancing economic equality and social inclusion, taking into account the specific needs and rights of ethnic and ethno-religious groups and indigenous peoples. And third, protect and preserve the cultural identity of ethnic and ethno-religious groups and indigenous peoples by fostering an enabling environment for them in which they can preserve, develop, and express and share their identities, histories, cultures, languages, traditions, and customs. Having lived in Thailand for 8 years, I can attest to the severe discrimination of Hill tribes peoples as the indigenous peoples of Thailand. In fact, government officials and the elite refers to them as aliens from China and Myanmar and not indigenous peoples in Thailand. This claim is disputed by historical accounts and on the movements of indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia prior to the formation of states in this region. This recent observation and recommendations of the third committee, when implemented, will significantly improve the conditions of indigenous peoples in Thailand. Another step by the third urgent action in April 2021 for the state of Indonesia. The committee mentions that the information received by the committee alleges that very few indigenous peoples have gained official state recognition. It alleges that in practice, local governments do not give recognition while some of them expressly deny the existence of certain indigenous peoples, a fact which, if verified, constitutes a major impediment to the exercise and protection of their rights. The committee reiterates its previous concerns and requests the government of Indonesia to provide information in relation to the measures adopted to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, including the right to consultation in the context of increasing presence of palm oil plantations in indigenous peoples' lands and territories, in particular the Kalimantan border oil palm mega project along the Indonesia-Malaysia international border. The urgent action procedure of the third has been very useful tool in raising global attention to the urgent cases of human rights violations of indigenous peoples. This case pertains to the refusal of some local governments to recognize the customary forests of indigenous peoples as recognized by the Constitutional Court. Instead, local governments are leasing these lands to palm oil companies, resulting to conflicts in a number of communities. The recommendation of the CERD to the government of Indonesia to provide measures to protect the rights of indigenous peoples to consultation and to their lands, territories, and resources affirm these collective rights of indigenous peoples, even if the government of Indonesia refused to recognize the more than 40% of its population as indigenous peoples. The government of Indonesia continues to claim we are all indigenous in Indonesia, while in reality, they are making a distinction to what they call the masyarakat adat, meaning the customary peoples, and these are the indigenous peoples of Indonesia. Another case of the decision made by CERD is in relation to Japan in August 2018. While noting the recent efforts by state party to protect and promote the rights of Ainu people, the committee is concerned that cases of discrimination against Ainu people in employment, education, and access to public services continue to be reported, and that despite some improvements, there continues to remain a gap between the living standards of the Ainu people and other residents in Hokkaido. Hokkaido is the territory of the Ainu people in Japan. While some efforts are being made to preserve Ainu language and culture, the protection of land and natural resource rights, and linguistic and cultural heritage of the Ainu peoples is not sufficiently ensured. The committee recommends that the state party step up efforts to eliminate discrimination against Ainu people in employment, education, and access to services. Second, adopt measures to protect land and natural resource rights of the Ainu people and continue to step up efforts for the realization of the rights to their culture and language. These observations and recommendations stress the need to also recognize and protect the rights of Ainu to their lands and resources, and to adequate representation in decision-making. It should be noted that the legal recognition of Ainu as the indigenous peoples of Japan refers largely to their right to their distinct culture and language, and not on the right of Ainu to their lands and resources, which the Ainu in Hokkaido has been asserting for decades. Let me then move on the observations and recommendations by the Committee on Civil and Political Rights in upholding the rights of indigenous peoples. This is in relation to the state of Bangladesh, which was made in April 2017. The committee observes the lack of legal recognition of indigenous peoples, reported discrimination and restrictions on the civil and political rights of indigenous peoples, in particular as it relates to lands and the participation in political decision-making processes. Recommendation: recognize the legal status of indigenous peoples, facilitate the reporting of violations of rights of indigenous peoples, investigate such cases, prosecute perpetrators and compensate victims, resolve land disputes through the implementation of the Chittagong Hill Tracts Land Dispute Resolution Commission Act of 2001 and amended in 2016. And through the use of an independent land commission, and include indigenous persons in political and decision-making processes. These recommendations by the CCPR, or the Committee on Civil and Political Rights, clearly links the individual rights and the collective rights of indigenous peoples, particularly in relation to our land rights. When Indigenous peoples assert our collective rights to our lands and resources through legitimate protest actions as part of our political rights, we are often subjected to restrictions, arbitrary arrests, detention with false criminal charges, and even violence and abuse against women. Another case is the state of Vietnam in August 2019. The committee is concerned that the state party does not recognize the indigenous peoples in Vietnam. It is further concerned that such communities suffer from discrimination, including with regard to education, employment, and public services. It remains concerned that such communities are not sufficiently consulted in decision-making processes with respect to issues affecting their rights, such as the seizure and allocation of land, including traditional and ancestral lands for development projects or offered appropriate remedies. It is also concerned that such development projects have negative impact on the community's culture, lifestyle, use of land and resources and livelihoods, resulting in the exacerbation of socioeconomic inequalities. This observation of the Committee on Civil and Political Rights again points out that the denial of individual right to identity affects severely the protection of our rights and in this case of indigenous peoples in Vietnam, our rights to our lands and resources, to our distinct cultures and lifestyle, and at the same time, our social and cultural rights are also neglected due to discrimination, such as the right to employment, education, and social services on one hand, and the adverse impacts of so-called development projects on the other hand, resulting to inequalities. For the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, it has also reiterated the land rights of indigenous peoples and the need for proper implementation of the free and informed prior and informed consent of indigenous peoples on matters that affect us adversely. An example of this is the case of the Philippines in October 2016. While noting the efforts made by the state party to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, the committee is concerned at the failure of the state party to uphold the right to free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples for any change to the use of their lands and resources, and to implement the mandatory representation of indigenous peoples in local decision-making bodies. The displacement of indigenous peoples, particularly those in Mindanao, owing to the armed conflict and intertribal conflicts, as well as extractive and logging operations. It thereby recommends the state party of the Philippines to take steps necessary to ensure the registration of indigenous lands, including through improving the collective land rights, land title claim process, and to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent on the concerned indigenous peoples is obtained before granting licenses to private companies, and those indigenous peoples are represented through their own chosen representatives in local decision-making, such as local mining boards and local development units. So another mechanism that has been important to indigenous peoples is the Universal Periodic Review, where it made strong recommendations in the case of India to continue to take steps to revise national laws and policies to fully recognize and protect the rights of indigenous peoples. So these are the observations, statements, and recommendations of treaty bodies affirming the rights of indigenous peoples as contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. While these are reiteration of the obligations of states to indigenous peoples, the implementation of these recommendations pertaining to the rights of indigenous peoples remains a huge challenge. It is thereby important to strengthen further capacities and collective actions of indigenous peoples at the local and national levels to demand the implementation of states' obligations to respect and provide the enabling environment for indigenous peoples to fully exercise our rights. To conclude, I just want to emphasize the need to strengthen the advocacy and engagements of indigenous peoples at all levels, and particularly to really strengthen the work of indigenous peoples at the national and local levels to demand the respect for our rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for your presentation. And also I think that it's very clear as well that your significant experience at the grassroots level, at the regional level, and also the international level, right, is able to share with us a different perspective, right, like a more complete perspective of things. And especially when you were talking about the interplay between the UN Declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples, and then how it interplays with other treaties as well. So thank you very much for that. And we're getting questions in as well. So yes, so again, thank you everybody who has questions. Continue sending them to us through the question and answers box. And so now we will continue to our third and final speaker. And I'm excited to present to all of you Khalil Alamor. So Khalil is an active member of the Al-Sira Community Council, and he is a member of the Regional Council for the Unrecognized Bedouin Villages in the Negev, or also known as the Nakab by the indigenous peoples. And we're shifting from the eastern part of Asia to the western part of Asia. He is from Israel. And he's also a secretariat member of the Negev Coexistence Forum for Civil Equality. He is the co-director of Al-Hukuk Legal Center, and he has been working in cooperation with other local and international human rights organizations to raise awareness about the rights of the indigenous Bedouin community in Israel and Palestine, and to empower and strengthen the local community. So with that, I will give the floor over to Khalil. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I will try to take you into those 20 minutes to a virtual tour in the unrecognized Bedouin villages in the Negev. You maybe see behind me the map here of the unrecognized villages. This is the only map that those villages appear on. So we are invisible here. So all those unrecognized villages don't appear in any official Israeli map. I'm very happy that we created our population in Israel, have created the three very meaningful organizations in 1997, 98. One of them is Adala, one of them is the NCF, and one is the Negev Coexistence Forum that I'm secretary member of. And the RCOV, the Regional Council of the Unrecognized Villages, those organizations, it changed a lot the situation, but still really not enough. So I will share my presentation soon, try to take you into this very short and quick tour to those villages so we can see some of them. Here we are. Can you see my presentation? I hope.
Yes, you can, or at least I can.
So we will move to the presentation issue. Okay. Okay, here we are. So this is a general view of one of the unrecognized villages. Yes, you can see we don't live in tents anymore, but in stone houses with concrete sometimes, and it's a metal roof in most of the cases. Today we have 35 unrecognized villages. Unfortunately, we're still fighting for their recognition and supplying services for them. We will learn very soon what does it mean to be unrecognized village in Israel, in the Negev, Nakab. So we will need a very short briefing, historical briefing about the situation and the Nakab in general. I don't know if you see the map here of the Negev, Israel, Palestine, or the area, because I see the pictures here, the profile in the left side of in the right side of the map of the presentation. Anyway, if you look here, you will see the southern part, which is the Negev, the Nakab, which is a huge area. It's 2/3 of the state land. And only 10% of the population in Israel now live in this area. The rest of 90% live in the north and mid and center of the state. In this area, in the past, only Bedouin lived in this area. So when Israel came in 1948, they just expelled most of our population, about 90,000 people. Most of them, the vast majority, was expelled to the neighboring Arab countries like Jordan here in this side, and Sinai, Jordan, and even 2 tribes to the West Bank, which was controlled in those days, 1948, under the Jordanian kingdom. The West Bank was occupied in 1967, as you may know, by Israel again. And those people who were expelled to this area moved again near Jerusalem. And now they live in what you, maybe most of you know, what's called Khan al-Ahmar. And they are still arguing whether to expel them for the 3rd time or not. Anyway, those 11,000 who survived the disaster, the Nakba here, Israel concentrated them into this area, which we called in Hebrew Izor Hasaig, or in Arabic Mantiqat al-Siyaj, or in English the siege area. The siege area, which is 10% of the Negev land, as you can see, a very small area. Those 11,000 growed and growed and growed, and today we are talking about 300,000 Bedouins in this area. But the land, the 10% shrink and shrink and shrink, and today we are talking about less than 5% of the historical lands of the Negev. So it's very, very complicated. And people have to survive, have to live under very hard conditions, under continuous attempt of the government always to uproot those people and concentrate them into these towns that the government established, some of them, 7 towns. We will see them soon. So this is a document that I always want to see and show. In the 1921, a delegation of Bedouin sheikhs met with Winston Churchill, and he promised them that all their rights and customs and everything will be really kept, and nobody will interfere with them. Unfortunately, those promises was broken and broken and broken. Here is the Siyaj area, the fence area or the siege area that we talked about a few seconds ago. And you just zoom in, and as you can see, this is the 10% of the Nakab of the Negev. Into this area, Israel established 7 towns, as you can see, those green spots, 7. Not in 1 year. It's started from 1969, 70s, in the 80s, another 2, in the 90s, another 2, and by the end, they became 7. As you can see, many of them were displaced from their places, as you can see in the arrows here. People were displaced from their original cities and towns and moved to this area. What happened to the rest of the land of the Negev? People lived under military regime, all Palestinians in Israel, including the Arab Palestinians in the north and the Bedouin in the south. All of them lived under military rule for 18 years, from 1948 till 1966. It was enough time for the Israeli government to legislate new rules and the new laws to take over those land and confiscate them as absentees land. Especially the Western Negev, which was a very fertile land, as you can see here, the Western Negev, this area and this area, and all of them. It was taken by the government, and now we are talking about 5%, not 9%. It's a very, very small area, and a continuous attempt to demolish those houses and take over those lands, and make afforestation, planting new trees, especially by the JNF. The JNF is the Jewish National Fund, if you don't remember. And that's why we have today those towns, and we have a lot of unrecognized villages. As you can see, they are assembled here by those circles. And some, about 10 of them, were recognized in the last 20 years, in 2003. You can see the red squares here. So we have 10 newly recognized, and after that, by the end, we have 35 that still unrecognized villages. What does it mean, unrecognized villages? We will see soon. Here is the proper plan that aimed to put an X on all those villages and move them from place to place. This plan was rejected by the Bedouin after a huge demonstration and even a call from the European Union and the European countries and the UN to stop this plan and open a negotiation with the Bedouin community. These pictures are from Al-Araqib. Al-Araqib is a very, very famous Bedouin village that was uprooted. You can see here it is even burned, and many trees was uprooted in 2010. Since that time, this village, you cannot believe, it was it was destroyed more than 150 times. And every time the sheikh of the village, the chairperson of the village, Sheikh Sayyah, promised to rebuild it again and again, and he always built a humble tents there, and they come and he demolish them every 2 weeks or every month. Here you can see the family of Sheikh Sayyah. Now they are concentrated in the cemetery. You can see the tent and the cemetery and the graves here in the graveyard. He is living here. This is Sayyah. You can see we have, I think, better pictures that you can see. And here near his house, near his village, they the JNF, as you can see here, the JNF, they planted a big forest that called the Ambassadors Forest. Here is the forest. Here is Sheikh Sayyah, accompanied by his attorney, advocate Shahde Ibn Barri. Here is him again on the horse, and in demonstrations everywhere is demonstrating. He cannot stop. The same happened to the villages of Atir and Amal Hiran. They wanted to uproot them. Both, this is Atir, they want to expand the forest here. One of the largest forests in the Middle East, I think it is the largest. They want to expand the forest and they demolished the village of Atir. Here is Atir and Amal Hiran. This is Amal Hiran and this is Atir. Also, they are threatened. Here they will expand the forest, this forest, the Atir forest. And in this side, they will demolish the village. And in the ruins of the village, they want to establish a new Jewish town with that called Hiran, without the Hiran. Here is the plan on the same place. You can see the village and the plan on the village. Here is Amal Hiran, you can see. Here is the plan again, And here is my village, it's Asera. You can see those villages, unrecognized villages. This is one of the unrecognized villages, Asera, my village. Those villages don't have names. And if they have names, they don't have signs. And if they have names and signs, they don't appear in any official map. But we added the name of the village and we added the sign, as you can see, in 3 languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and English. And even a short line here which says established in the Ottoman period. And this beautiful sign, as you can see, that you never see in any road in your way in the world when you drive, that says demolitions ahead. This is the deed of my family when they bought the land, this land in 23rd of November 1921. Exactly more than 100 years before, from now, many years before the establishment, 27 years before the establishment of the State of Israel. Here with the British stamps on it and the signatures of all the sheikhs of the Bedouin families in the area. So we are talking about unrecognized villages. As you can see, they are not, they exist and don't exist. Nobody knows where are they. There is no address, no security. People don't feel secure, always under the threat of demolitions. The address is the tribe. No right to vote for local elections. We only vote in general elections. No public transportation. People pay all the taxes and get nothing. Almost no running water from in many villages. No connection to electricity, no kindergartens, no schools, no ownership on the land. Endless list of no's, but only one yes, which is the bulldozer that demolishes houses everywhere. We have more than 2,000 demolitions a year. Beside that, the government also pressure the people and the communities here and the farmers, and they come every year and they blow their fields after they have already grown their barley or wheat, as you can see in the picture. Putting fences around and taking land and with many excuses like military zones or natural reserves and others. Water is one of the issues that the government or the authorities everywhere trying to use to pressure the communities. Very, very few and weak supply for the families. These pipes that you can see is not for one family. It is usually for cluster of families or sometimes even for the whole village. And they have to take care for the system, maintaining everything. Those roads, those highway roads block the access to the villages. So sometimes any Bedouin unrecognized village have to go round and round and round to have access to the main road, which is it can be crucial, especially in emergency cases. Those demolition orders are posted here in the door of my house and in the doors of all the houses in the village. It was in 2006. We needed to run in the court about 8 years, from 2006 till 2014. Then it was canceled by the district court after appealing of the government to the Supreme Court and to the district court and many others. Here is a demonstration of the Bedouin community in Beersheba, the district city here in the region, and when in Jerusalem, as you can see in Jerusalem, all about the home demolitions. It is our little Muhammad is also demonstrating against the private plan, and this is our tent near the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. And here we are talking to the media and to politicians, ambassadors, special rapporteurs, solidarity groups that came to visit the village. We are building our places, our mosque, laying our pipes to connect the village to water. We are not only playing the role of victims. We did a lot. Here is our solar system to provide electricity for the houses of the village. I started that in 2003, and more families joined, and today all the villages connected to electricity through in this way of solar panels. We go to the court. We participate. We partner with the other NGOs, with other organizations. We created our alternative plan and represented it to the government, but they denied it and didn't want to accept it. We come everywhere and try to share this with the organizations, people, and the universities, UN representatives, European Parliament members, and everyone who is ready to listen and hear about our issues. So you can do that now, make that now. You can visit us, you can join our lists, you can come and visit us. We are always welcoming people. And more than that, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil, for the presentation as well, and thank you for sharing your screen and for showing photos actually from your community and from the Unrecognized Village. And I think another thing too, when us as students of the organizing committee, when we were looking and selecting, oh, and it looks like you're still sharing your screen as well. There it goes. When we were looking for potential speakers, we were also really excited that you were going to be able to join us as well, because I think that focus, or that getting experiences and hearing about the situation of other Indigenous peoples, excuse me, in other regions of Asia is really interesting, because not only does it kind of go towards some of the points that Victoria and then Joanne were also pointing as well, right? Or pointing out when it comes to the diversity of Indigenous peoples in general, not just in Asia, but across the world, but especially in Asia as well. I think that that's a really key point. But then also at the same time, many of the things that you were sharing about the challenges that the Indigenous peoples, the Bedouin community and the Negev face, right, is something that fall along the same themes as other Indigenous peoples and what they're facing as well. So thank you so much for that.
Pleasure.
Oh, perfect. So we have plenty of time now for question and answers, and we are starting to get a lot in as well. So okay, perfect. So I see Victoria, you have turned on your camera, and then also Joanne as well. we will start and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So I'm going to first start with a kind of a difficult a difficult one, and I'll direct this at Joanne just to confirm. Joanne, are you still with us? Okay, so then maybe what I'll do is, excuse me.
Hello?
Victor, oh, you're there?
Yeah, she's
Okay.
there.
Yeah, sorry.
Perfect. No problem at all. No problem at all. So the first question that I have, I'll direct at you, but then I'll also leave it open for comment from Victoria and then also Khalil as well. And it is a very specific question, right? So it is from one of the attendees. His name is Matyur Rahman from Assam in India. And he has a specific question about the indigenous communities in India. And I think kind of the general theme that maybe would be really interesting to hear your perspective, Joanne, is about, you know, what can indigenous communities, you know, like when you are working with indigenous communities and giving suggestions and recommendations to use the UN system, right? Like if you could tell us a little bit about that and what suggestions and how you work with those communities as well and such. So the specific question is, in India, the UN DRIP is not implemented. Though India with 143 countries voted in favor of the UN DRIP on the 13th of September in 2007. So basically the specific indigenous community has submitted a written petition in the Supreme Court of India, urging the court to issue a direction for implementation of the UN DRIP in Assam and for the whole of India as well. But the written petition is pending in the constitutional bench. And so as the indigenous peoples are deprived from political rights, land rights, et cetera. And so in this regard, the question is how can the UN and the indigenous communities at the international level potentially help or support that those actions being taken and the activism that's being taken?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Let me say that that even in the national laws of India, there's actually already a recognition of indigenous peoples as scheduled tribes or Adivasis. That's the term used to identify the indigenous peoples in India, and they actually have land rights as it relates to the forest rights, right? And this is provided mainly in the mainland. The situation in Northeast India with the states in Northeast India is quite different with the political setup of India. But nevertheless, India is actually going to be reviewed this year under the Universal Periodic Review, where their human rights obligations are going to be reviewed in terms of their implementation of the recognition and respect for rights, and that will include the indigenous people's rights. So I think it's important, again, for like I mentioned, what's important, as also Vicky mentioned, we need to document and raise all the violations that's happening, because those are the evidence that we can show to the international community and also in the national courts, to show that the rights of indigenous peoples are violated, and it can be referred to even national laws that are actually respecting indigenous peoples' rights but are being violated by the state. So this can also be used in national courts and in the international level. And the National Human Rights Commission of India is actually very active in looking into these cases. So there are already cases where they are bringing they are investigating and recommending for legal action, for example. So these are the possible things that can be done for India to really push for the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples in India. We know it's a difficult time with Modi now because of, you know, the repression, and that he is a corporate guy, right? So it's tougher. That's also why more evidence is needed to be shown, so that the government cannot just simply deny these violations. Sorry for taking some time.
Yeah, maybe I can add a few points as well. Is it okay, Julia? Okay. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. I support what Joanna said, and I think that it's also important that uh, for me, a big thing that can lead towards changes is really the empowerment of the indigenous peoples themselves, no, at the local level. Because if the indigenous peoples keep on asserting these rights and using the tools or the bodies to assert and claim these rights, then maybe there can be some changes. I remember when I was a special rapporteur, there was this Supreme Court decision, isn't it, to amend again the Forest Rights Act of India, and at that time there was this push to displace indigenous peoples from the forest, more than a million indigenous peoples. And I wrote to the government, I wrote to the Supreme Court, and of course I communicated with some of the directly affected communities, and I think that's what needs to be done constantly, no, not to use any kind of opportunity, whether this is the special rapporteur or the other treaty bodies, to push, for the country, to push the country to recognize those rights that you indeed deserve. The other thing is, use also these existing opportunities. Like now, as you may have been told, it's the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, no? And I know that there are hundreds of languages in India. You just are not speaking Hindi, no? And that's an opportunity for you to push the government to recognize these languages. And in a way, that's also a way of recognizing the indigenous languages themselves. I mentioned this because I remember when I spoke earlier, I mentioned about our Amasir friend who was not allowed to put a nameplate in his own language. And now, just recently, I found the news that says that finally the Algerian government recognized Amasir as a national language. Can you imagine how long it took? But now, because of the indigenous year of the decade of indigenous languages or what have you, they finally recognize it, and that is a very big victory, no, for the Amasir who were banned from speaking their own or using their own languages. So I think those are just a few inspirations, no, that we can see, and it's for me, it's persistence, it's empowerment, your capacity to organize yourselves and continue to use existing mechanisms, and of course solidarity, getting the solidarity of other indigenous organizations and other bodies, relevant bodies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and Victoria as well. And so then, Victoria, I'll direct the next question to you then. So from your experience, do you consider that free, prior, and informed consultation is still an effective guarantee to protection of collective rights of Indigenous peoples, particularly related to the right to land?
Okay. Well, yes, I still believe that that's really the basic, framework that we should use as indigenous peoples, because that is what has been denied of us. No, that we were not consulted when development projects are made, when when laws are made that are against us. There was no consultation whatsoever. So free, prior, informed consent is really crucial. And 6 articles in the declaration talk about the need to obtain free, prior, informed consent of indigenous peoples. Even if it's not implemented as we would like it to be, our task is to continuously assert that government should respect this. This is what is contained in the declaration. This is also a basic right, for peoples, especially for collectives whose rights are always violated, and the consultation, the democratic process of consulting them is not obtained. So I think that it's still an effective instrument, but we need to be more sophisticated in terms of pushing for it, in terms of identifying what are the violations, where did they not consult, what are the issues that were not consulted and that were not discussed, and bring this to the attention of the rapporteur, the treaty bodies, as well as even in your courts and the national human rights institutions. So the more opinions that come that say that this right is violated, I think there will be, it will eventually snowball into some decisions and opinions, public opinions, that will be critical of the actions of states that don't obtain the free, prior, informed consent of indigenous peoples.
Can
Thank you,
I
Victoria.
just
Oh,
say the
yeah, continue. Mhm.
because I think the one that was asked was a prior and informed consultation.
Consultation, that's not,
Yeah,
but we
so-
don't use consultation.
So that has to correct that. No, it was the World Bank who made
Yeah,
that
exactly. Yeah.
coined that instead of free, prior, and informed consent, they coined it as consultation, which weakens the whole concept, because it does not, consent does not refer to collective decision making. So it's important that we differentiate the two. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, I think that's super important, Victoria, what you were saying, and then also the comment too from Joanne. So thank you about that and for explaining that last part. So then the next question I have, I'll direct towards Khalil. And the attendee says, will acknowledge that even if it is not recognized as collective rights, demolishing people's livelihoods, people's homes is already a violation of individual rights. And the person asks, how has the European community responded to the Israeli violation to collective rights? And I guess even more so than that too is, have in the activism that you have been doing, that your community has been doing, has there been or have you reached out or coordinated at all with the European community?
Oh, that's a good question. We unfortunately don't find enough support from the European Parliament, from the European Commission, from the European community in general. We are expecting more support, more pressure on to change this negative and discriminatory policy against the indigenous Bedouin community here. The most significant involvement of the European community was during the demonstration and the big debate around the private plan, where the government tried to implement a plan that decided one-sided by the government and tried to uproot all the Bedouin family from their ancestral villages and homes and concentrate them into towns. That was without their decent agreement and consultation with the community. Even that this process have already passed the first reading in the Israeli parliament, it was halted and defreezed after a very clear call of the European Union to stop those one-sided actions and open in a direct negotiation with the Bedouin community and have a compromise or agreement with them. But we didn't have any agreement and compromise about that. That's why it was frozen. It's really a problematic issue that we have those punishment, which is sometimes like collective punishment. Sometimes it's in the individual rights that being interfered or violated. But the issue, I always claim that it's internal issue because we are considered as Israeli citizens. We are not in occupied territory like our other Palestinian brothers in the West Bank or Gaza. So they always say this is an internal issue, and they are Israeli citizens and can come to the Israeli court, which is not really the right thing that we can do up to now, because we are always losing here. It's a magic. if we conclude, it's so complicated, more than you can imagine.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Khalil.
Okay.
And then the next question I'll direct to Victoria. So in your experience as former UN Special Rapporteur, and perhaps in your larger experience, right, the wider experience, were you able to interact with Indigenous peoples in Central Asia? And if so, what unique challenges do they face?
Well, unfortunately, not very much. You know, I know Central Asia are those TANs, no, the Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and all that. And many of these used to be the former Soviet Union, no. So, so it's not very easy. Number one, they do. You know, as a special rapporteur, you cannot visit any country if you are not invited officially by the government, and not a single government has invited me. You know, in Central Asia, in Asia, the only government that invited me was East Timor, no, and during the term of Jim, it was, I think, Nepal, and in the time of Savenhagen, it was the Philippines. So there are very few Asian countries who invite rapporteurs, no? And so it's not very easy to engage with those people. But I did engage with some of the people who come from those, very few people who come from those countries, because they don't also take part in the processes where the indigenous peoples meet, like the UN Permanent Forum, no, or the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people. So that's the unfortunate thing, and I think that there needs to be much more effort to reach out to them, you know, and to see what can be done on how they are asserting their rights or identities as indigenous peoples. No, of course we know about what's happening in Ukraine now, you know, where many of the indigenous peoples in Ukraine are of course also in a very difficult situation. So we have to express our solidarity with them as well, and they spoke up. No, they spoke up saying that they are totally against the invasion of Russia of their territories, and even the indigenous peoples in Russia also spoke up, and they made a statement denouncing the invasion of Russia of Ukraine, because it does affect the indigenous people. So this is the reality that we see now, and there is a lot more work that needs to be done from all of us.
Thank you. And then I guess kind of along the same lines, or a little bit along the same lines, is kind of talking about Indigenous peoples and collective rights, and then also minority rights as well. And so I guess a question for you, for also Joanne possibly, and also for Khalil, is about the interplay, right? So what happens if ethnic or ethno-religious groups and Indigenous people have some kind of dispute, I guess you can say, about collective rights, like land-related rights, property. So, and how can you guys speak a little bit to that?
Well, I think that yes, indeed, we cannot ignore that there are some disputes, no, on some over land, you know. But I think that for me, my approach to that is really the need for intercultural dialogues, no, between them and with the support of others, because of course historically many of those lands have really been occupied and developed by the indigenous peoples, but the governments, they also bring in settlers, no, to also minoritize the indigenous peoples, as well as to divide and conquer, you know, the people who are adamant in protecting the rights to their lands. So we also have to look at the role that the states play, you know, in relation to this, so that the conflict will not just be between the minorities or the settlers or the indigenous peoples, but it's between them and the state, who is not providing their rights, you know. I mean, and they are using these vulnerable peoples to be fighting with each other, and that earlier until the government is consciously sending a lot of Bengalis to the indigenous territories of the Chakma, of the indigenous peoples there in the minority they are the ones claiming the lands, no, and pushing away indigenous people. So, and they are using the army, no, to support them. So I have been there several times, and I've seen the situation. In fact, I was in one day I was there, and there was a big demonstration against us who were visiting, as well as, of course, the indigenous peoples. And you can see that it's all manipulated and organized by the government, because when they had English slogans in their posters, but when we asked them if they know what they are telling, they said no. So that's the kind of picture that you see in many places. And I think what we need to do is to really to push the government to recognize, of course, this diversity of indigenous peoples within the country, for us to push for a more constructive intercultural dialogues between all the different peoples living in a particular space, and to make them see exactly, what advantage there is with or disadvantage, the pros and cons of them fighting with each other, instead of uniting together to protect, the sources of their identities as well as their livelihoods.
Thank you, Victor. And Joanne, did you want to comment on that at all?
No, I fully agree. I fully agree with Vicky. So it's really important to discern the historical context of any kind of this conflict, and to be sure that it should be evaluated from the lens of just, fair, and equitable resolution of this kind of conflicts. That it should be within the lens of indigenous people's collective rights, that we should also look at this, because sometimes they use the legal system to actually deny the land rights of indigenous peoples. Aside from using the people, they also use the legal system that,
Exactly,
that are against or in violation to the collective rights of indigenous peoples.
In fact, in the Philippines, I just wanted to add, in the Philippines, we have a very strong Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which gives titles, certificates of ancestral domain titles to indigenous peoples. No, but at the same time, you have the Department of Agrarian Reform, who has a certificate of land ownership title, and they go and they overlap with the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples using individuals, because these are individual titles that they use. So you see, so we have to pursue dialogues between the indigenous peoples and, of course, the government agencies, to stop using these laws to violate the rights of indigenous people. So, this is really something that happens on a daily basis for indigenous peoples. And this is terrible. And I wanted to actually connect this with what Khalil was saying earlier about, even this reforestation or forest projects of government. For instance, in Nicaragua, there is this national protected areas, Busawas, and the government has pushed settlers to go there, and they're fighting the indigenous peoples, So even so-called actions, taken by government, whether under the guise of climate change, and even biodiversity conservation, sometimes these are also violating indigenous people's rights.
Thank you. And then the next question is directed towards Halil, and it is, can you please share more about the voting rights and representation at all levels of the government of the Bedouin peoples in Israel, and specifically the differences between the rights for the Bedouin community, but then also the rest of the population in civil and political rights?
Yeah. We have many obstacles. I think the main ones that started all that, or the base of the troubles that we are meeting there today, or the challenges, is the fact that the Israeli government ignored our rights as indigenous people. The first thing is denying our rights on our land, the ownership on our land. So That's why they continue the confiscation issues and taking over land and deforestation everywhere. The Zionist movement since before the establishment of the state and after is still using the same mechanism, the same ideology that and excuses that sell very well in the Western countries. We are flourishing the desert. We are making it bloom, and by planting more and more trees here and there. But people don't know that they, after or before every tree that is planted here in a forest, there is a family that is uprooted, a Bedouin family, indigenous Bedouin family that is uprooted, unfortunately. And this also reflects many other rights, like the civil rights, because those unrecognized villages are denied from many basic services, civil rights, like voting. There is no voting polls in the unrecognized villages. People have to travel miles and miles to reach sometimes the nearest place where they can vote. For I'm talking about the general election, not the local ones. We don't have local councils. We don't have the local services like trash collecting or sewage system or water supply or connecting to the grid or all these. Beside all that, the other services like clinics, schools, kindergartens, also people have to find a way to reach those places. The only thing that is really organized by the government is the buses. The kids are bused to the schools, to the neighboring towns where they have the governmental schools, and they can join and can study there. But clinics, every family have to go alone. Women, where they want to have their children, take their children for vaccination, or they want to take their test for pregnancy or so on, they have to be rich and have car with her husband to take her there, go, or if she are lucky, she have a license and can drive also. So complicated, and many basic services and basic rights are violated here.
Thank you, Khalil. And then I think we have one more question that I'll open it to all three of you, right? I think we can start with Victoria and then Joanne and then finish with Khalil. And it's a simple but a difficult question, right? So also considering that a significant amount of the attendees here today, you know, that we are studying this field, are studying human rights, are already human rights activists. So what advice would all of you give to new human rights activists?
Well, from my side, I think that new human rights activists should really study the instruments that are protecting human rights. No, they should know these instruments, and they should know exactly how these instruments can be used. You know, because sometimes we feel so helpless, no, and we think that there is no recourse whatsoever to the problems that we face. So, number one, you have to know that. Secondly, I think that there really needs to be, human rights activists really need to link closely, with the human rights victims, because and give more spaces to the human rights victims to represent themselves and to speak, to the relevant bodies or use the relevant bodies. And thirdly, if you are able to, of course, support them when they have to bring cases, to their own courts, as well as to the courts outside of their countries, whether this is the, of course, in Asia, we are very unfortunate because we don't have an equivalent of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, or Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So I think for Asia, we have to work even strongly for the establishments of those kinds of grievance mechanisms, at the regional level. Asia has a very specific characteristic because of the nature of many of the nation states in Asia, and the work that we need to do is more challenging.
Okay. Yeah, of course I support Vicky on that, and to add that for new human rights activists, it would be important to integrate and interact with the human rights holders in indigenous communities. Those are the struggling on the ground, because knowing the real situation also adds to the richness in appreciating and the need to firm up our commitment in the face of dangers that we are facing. So that's one. A second, as Vicky has mentioned, is to also express their solidarity to these indigenous communities and victims, because we always feel, in many communities, feel that they're left alone, right? That nobody cares. But if they know that there are human rights activists out there willing to support them, then it also gives them more courage and strengthens their resolve to push for their demands. So that's the second. The third, as I mentioned, is like I said, there's gaps in terms of human rights documentation, and taking testimonies for victims because of the lack of literacy and understanding legal requirements. And that's where human rights activists can come in and assist communities in writing their testimonies, preparing documents, but not taking out the voice from them, but rather helping them put together in such a way that it can be submitted, or it can be used, even submission to national human rights commissions, right? So these are the things that I think new human rights activists can do. But finally, to say that yes, we need you, and keep on being an activist, and to be with us. Thank you.
I think that a new activist, youngest activist, have to learn a lot from their colleagues in their areas locally, first of all, because the problems and the challenges are different from place to place and from community to community. And if you learn from the previous or old warriors or the fighters before, you will learn better and learn the situation. Search all the area and learn the facts, the numbers, everything, so you can really convince your friends and colleagues and other people and the government people that are arguing all the time. And the third thing is networking. Networking is always good to learn from our other indigenous brothers in all the world, meeting with them, exchanging experiences and the stories, and see how they found the solution for this and that and that. Maybe sometimes they didn't and you didn't, and you can join together and find another ways or think about common issues and solutions. Today, it's easy to communicate. We have a variety of ways to communicate with the social media and other ways. And it's all in our side, in our favor, to do more and more for our communities, I hope.
Thank you, Khalil, and also Joanne and Victoria. Thank you so much for answering so many of those questions. And I know there's still many that that we weren't able to get to, but I would like now, we are closing up pretty soon. So I am now going to introduce Dr. Julian Barker, who will be giving the closing remarks for the second day of the Human Rights in Asia conference. So Dr. Julian Barker, he is a visiting professor at the Human Rights Center here at the University of Essex. And he has had significant experience. He has headed the UN Indigenous and Minority Program at the OHCHR for more than 20 years. He is also currently an expert of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights investigation of human rights violations in Bolivia during the events of 2019. So I give the floor now to Dr. Julian Barker.
Well, good afternoon, good morning. Very late in the evening, I think, in Philippines. I'm not sure where you all are. It's lovely to see very familiar faces and to meet Khalil. Thanks also for the students. I'll make four comments briefly, because I know we haven't got much time. And I'll try and be a little bit orienting towards the students in particular. Very often, one of the first questions we discuss when we talk about Indigenous peoples in the university is, who are these people? Definition of kind. And I'm really grateful for the presentation of Khalil to tell us about the Indigenous peoples of the Negev. I have to say that my experience in the United Nations was a continual discovery of Indigenous peoples. For example, African Indigenous peoples did not participate in any UN meetings until the 1990s or so. Similarly with Russian Federation, or USSR as it was, and a number of countries in Asia. So this is an interesting scope, and I think it's been very important to understand that it's a very open understanding of peoples who are facing the same kinds of issues as Khalil raised: a loss of land, discrimination, exclusion, and so on. And when there was a mention of Central Asia, of course, many of those peoples are nomadic, living collectively on their traditional lands. They haven't happened to participate for different political reasons, but I can be totally convinced that in the years to come, they will be very active in this forum. So I think it's very important to understand the issues are not defined in people, but in terms of the issues they're facing. And this leads me to really an important issue, and that's the question of visibility, because the truth is we don't know if Central Asia has Indigenous people, because nobody's come and said, well, we are, because we recognize the same problems as other Indigenous peoples. A second point I wanted to make, and I think very important, especially I'm directing my comments a bit to students, is that human rights include collective rights. We shouldn't see them as collective versus human or individual human rights, but as a complementary set of rights. I mean, we all have collective rights. When we participate in elections, we are actively participating collectively in the manner in which we're being governed very badly at the moment in my country and probably in a few others. But nonetheless, what we have is, so the question of collective rights is extremely important to see as not something distinct, but as something actually complementary. And of course, it's true that most universities teaching human rights do not teach collective rights at all. Essex, it didn't for a long time. In fact, it hardly does at the moment, teach about collective rights or really self-determination and concepts of that kind. So I think it's been very important to hear the comments made by Vicky and by Joanne on the importance of collective rights for Indigenous people. I'm not going to repeat what they say, but I do think that it's very vital for us when we're looking at human rights to go broader than the simple individual rights. The other important issue is knowing what is going on, and I really appreciate the presentation, very pedagogic about the human rights system, the importance, having Vicky there talking about her experience as a rapporteur and as a member of the forum, Joanne as well. And I appreciate very much all of the detail given by Joanne about the treaty bodies, UPR, and specifically cases coming up. And I think that's very important. I do want to say something I learned from Indigenous peoples in relation to treaty bodies and so on, and the human rights, is that the human rights doesn't stop at the OHCHR or the Human Rights Council. Human rights or the interests of Indigenous peoples and their rights go way beyond our narrow work we do at Essex, I have to say, which is very focused on the work being done within the sort of Human Rights Council. I was very surprised when I started working at the UN to learn about the work of the World Intellectual Property Organization. I couldn't possibly understand why they should be interested in indigenous people. They weren't, absolutely, but why indigenous people should be interested in them, until we began to understand that the intellectual property rights of indigenous peoples that are being violated. And the WIPO has a role to play in trying to protect that. So, and we can go not just within that system of the WIPO and the others, and UNDP and the UNESCO and the UNICEF, the ILO, and of course the banks like the Asia Development Bank, the World Bank, European Bank, and so on. So I think it's really important, and this is again a bit addressing the students, that you don't confine yourselves to the Human Rights Council. The human rights is everywhere in the UN system, and there are lots of places where you can push and work and promote this broader view of human rights. And finally, I mean, not finally, almost finally, well, yeah, finally, because I have very little time, implementation. I mean, yes, of course, there are lots of very important recommendations made by lots of very important UN and regional human rights organizations, but quite often they don't get implemented. And that is the real issue. Vicky made reference to the violence against human rights defenders, environmental defenders, and indigenous peoples, mostly actually in Latin America at the moment, but everywhere. And these are the implementation is really the issue. How do you get it done? And here I want to again address students and say, yes, there's so much that can be done at the UN level, but there's also other things going on. There's litigation, which has been very important development, taking companies to court, taking governments to court. The whole work that's been going on at the European level about the Mercosur agreement, a treaty and so on, between the South American countries, some of them, and so on. So there are opportunities there for other forms of implementation of human rights. And my last comment really would be, again, to students who are going to be activists, is yes, yeah, do it, and listen to the recommendations of the indigenous people, of those who are facing, who are the vulnerable groups facing at the grassroots level, some of these issues. And again, many thanks to all of you at the Asia, working on the Asia seminar, get it going, and getting such fantastic people to share their experiences. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Julian, for that. And then now, everybody, we will be closing. So again, a huge thank you. I guess I'll first start with the participants and with the attendees, I should say, right? Not only those who attended today, but then also last week as well. And then a really, really huge thank you to our speakers, to Victoria, to Joanne, and to Khalil today, for taking the time out of your weekends to come and to speak with us and to share your knowledge and your experiences. And a reminder to everybody, it is 1 p.m. here in the UK, but it is late afternoon for Khalil in Israel, and it is 9 p.m. if I'm not mistaken for Joanne and Victoria. So a huge thank you to all of you for your participation. It was really, really wonderful and awesome to have you here. And then finally, just to remember that this is a yearly conference, that the theme, the topics change every single year. So we hope to be able to see some of you next year as well. And so have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, and
bye.
bye.